So I think we give it a go. A very, very warm welcome to all of you on the panel and also in the audience. I'm happy that so many people managed to join us today. This is going to be a very, very interesting discussion and sadly relevant. The first thing I want to tell is that as we started designing this event, the current war was nowhere in sight. And in the meantime, this event and this topic gained special relevance with whatever is happening on the eastern borders of the European Union. So we do have to address that topic, and we will somewhat later. Let me introduce you, first of all, the rundown of these 1.5 hours this afternoon. This roundtable will be divided into 3 parts, 3 equal parts, approximately half an hour each. The first is what you can call an input block. That is what you can also call the small round. We are having 3 fantastic panelists to discuss the question you have in the title. They will deliver very short opening statements, and then we will move along 3 questions within the topic of EU and China and in the democracy-autocracy binary. After this initial half an hour, we will have a second half an hour where the 2 discussants will join us from the very specific perspectives. And in the final half an hour, we will open the floor to all of you, meaning the audience, for a Q&A session. So let me introduce us first. We are organizing this event through CHERN China Europe Research Network, Working Group 4, where I am coordinator. Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova is the technical manager, also member of our working group, and the co-organizers of this event are the Democracy Institute people of Central Eastern European University. My name is Agota Revesz, and I myself speak as a sinologist, but I will try to ask questions and not to meddle a lot into the discussion itself. The first round is the round of the 3 panelists. Let me introduce them to you. Zhang Yongjin, who is political scientist working at the University of Bristol, focusing on international relations theory and China. Gudrun Wacker, who is working for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She is originally a China studies expert, sinologist, focusing on security issues. And Una Aleksandra, who is joining us from Riga, Latvia, political scientist focusing on discourse in China, on China. So they are our first 3 speakers, and I asked them to issue a very short opening statement, 1 to 2 minutes long, on the title for today, Navigating EU-China Relations in the Democracy-Autocracy Binary. Who wants to start? Ladies first, Gudrun.
Okay, I will start. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I think it's good that we discuss this. Usually when we talk about binaries, we think about computers, and they're basically the only thing that works on the basis of 0 and 1. Governments try to avoid binaries, and I think that the EU-China relationship is an example for that, the EU tries to avoid a binary framing of the issue. If you look at the official document on the EU's China strategy, the outlook on China that was published in spring 2019, it mentions 3 dimensions of the relationship with China: cooperation, partner, competitor, and systemic rival. And the systemic rival, it alludes to the autocracy topic because it basically says China is a systemic rival that pursues different forms of governance and tries to compete with the Western ideas about global governance. So it alludes to the autocracy topic, but it doesn't talk about the political system of China directly. So I think if we look at the EU and also the member states, usually they try not to frame things in these binary terms. Sometimes you are forced to. In the case of the Russian invasion, there was no chance to, there is no third way, although we tried it long enough. But on China, we're not there yet. And so the question is how long this triad, this 3-dimensional relationship can work.
Thank you very much. Maybe Una, you want to go next?
Sure. So if Gudrun's intervention was very based in real policy, then mine is going to be an absolute attempt to tackle this conceptually. So first of all, I think the question that you asked is a trick question, which is great, because there's binary in the name, but there's also binary in the question. Is it helpful or is it not helpful? So I want to answer it like this. Methodologically, it is helpful for some questions to approach analysis through this binary, but not others. But of course, it can sometimes in foreign policy, it can explain why states act the way we act. For example, in my research on Russia, China, it is sometimes justified because we see that the constraints that the authoritarian leaders face are just different. And the price of failure to remain in power is much higher. So we see, for example, the stress on personalized friendships, the narrative, for example, between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin as this personal narrative of friendship, which is a very authoritarian thing. And also, we were always, when we started to analyze China, we always bump into the question: how much do the leaders really care about public opinion? How much do they care about what the people really think? So I think that is very different from what we have in democracies. But in other cases, for example, as Bobo has pointed out, in other cases, this binary does not work. For example, if we look at Russia, India, China relationship, let's imagine that tomorrow Russia and China become democratic countries and India's backsliding stops. They will be still facing the same constraints and the same challenges in their relationship that they're facing today. But for example, another situation when this binary is not helpful, I want to draw from the research from our colleague Vrije Universiteit, who works in the US, and she's written on Chinese soft power in Ethiopia. And her argument is, once you drop the binary democracy-autocracy lens, that's when you start making good connections, because in fact, a lot of things that China is doing can also be traced back to, for example, what the US is doing, or kind of compared, right? So I want to end my intervention by saying it's definitely, so to turn the question back around, it's a spectrum, not a binary. And in some cases, it is extremely helpful. In some cases, it's not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zhang Yongjin, your turn.
Thanks, Agota, for inviting me to this roundtable. I'll just start with 3 purposefully provocative kind of comments, just to kind of start conversation. The first one is really the framing of the democracy vis-a-vis autocracy, a binary. Particularly, autocracy poses an existential threat to liberal democracy, is a kind of social fact that has been created predominantly in and by Washington. It seems to me, certainly reading from here, It has been more or less accepted in Brussels and also shared by many European elites throughout the EU. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has only hardened this kind of framing. The second point I want to make is that Beijing doesn't seem to see the strategic rivalry between China and the United States in such an ideological framing. Certainly not as you die and I live, 你死我活, the kind of fight between autocracy and democracy. And the third point I want to make is it will be a colossal strategic error for the EU to follow the United States to conduct its relationship with China through such a binary. I think it would do more harm than good to both EU and China, and more importantly, to humanity. Now, I'll just leave you with a critical question. Why suddenly we have such a framing at this particular historical juncture? Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is also my initial question to the panel. I just put it somewhat differently, but my question was, what is the driver behind this polarization, behind this binary of democracies versus autocracies? So why do we have it? What is driving it?
Okay, you want me to start?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, I think I agree with Yongjin. I would also say the main driver, and this is really under Donald Trump, that this framing in serious terms starts in Washington. Although for Trump, probably the ideological dimension of this was, not very important. It was about US supremacy. But with Biden as a Democratic president, this has been more ideologized, so to speak, this kind of framing. So I think we see a comeback of ideology, and strangely not in China or Russia. What I really find, for example, if you look at the joint statement between China and Russia that was signed a few days before the Russian invasion, they actually argue they are the better democracies because they deliver to the people. So this whole framing gets sort of blurred because the other side simply turns the words around and redefines the topic of, what a democracy is. So they actually use the old argument, output. We have output-based legitimacy, and democracies just have input-based legitimacy, but they don't deliver anymore. And I think in China, this kind of thought started seriously when the global financial crisis happened, because the West was unable to prevent that. And I think this is another reason why we have this debate now and this framing now, and why it has gotten some traction, is that democracies are under pressure everywhere, even within the European Union. And it has something to do with the fact that after the end of the Cold War, we basically systematically neglected to tell the citizens in our own countries why democracy is important. So we have a backslide, and I think there are new numbers out that for the first time, we have more non-democracies than democracies in the world. So actually democracies are in retreat. And so the narrative, and I come to pick up what Una said in the beginning, and this already leads to your second question. One of the advantages this might have, this framing, is to mobilize support in our own societies. And this is why it has some traction. Whether it's very helpful for the relationship with another country that you place in the opposite camp is a different question.
Yes, thank you, Gudrun. Una or Yongjin, do you want to reflect on that?
I think I think the so-called polarization is a false one. Now, just look at the responses to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I see over there almost like the West vis-a-vis the rest. Because if you look at the BRICS countries' response, India is democracy, South Africa is a democracy, and China, of course, is autocratic. But they actually all three abstained from the UN resolution, and they also have very different approach to the sanction issues and so on. So I wonder whether we really have a kind of polarization between democracy and autocracy. The other example, I was very concerned. I was shocked, frankly. A few days ago, I read an article talking about the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security, Joseph Borrell, making a speech at last year's Global Progressive Forum. I couldn't believe, I thought it might be disinformation from Chinese scholars. Maybe they just take some kind of words out of context. I went to see the video. Let me read the quote. So this is from the UN High Representative Borrell. We Western people, the US and EU, we have been ruling the world. We were the masters of how technology is working. If we are no longer standard setting, we will not rule the 21st century. Now, this is shocking from the high kind of representative of EU, talking about this kind of ruling the world, the West. Again, this kind of democracy vis-a-vis kind of autocracy framing collapsed immediately for me.
Thank you, Una.
Yes, it's really so very many threads here, so it's hard to pick up on one. So I'll just go in a completely different direction. And I just wanted to say, yes, of course, it's I think that the distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy now is also something that Gudrun said. Let's take, for example, Poland. I think we sometimes when we get locked into the binary, we sometimes fall prey to the circular argument. For example, Poland's got issues, hence the bad laws, and the bad laws then contribute to backsliding. But when in fact, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of international role, and especially today during the war in Ukraine, Poland has proven to be, a helpful and overachiever actually when it comes to this international community. So I think it's really important to, again, to go back to my original point, it's very important to make this distinction. But now just to go to your question, what, with the driver behind this increasing polarization, I would not go quickly to dismiss ideology here, because actually ideology on the sides of the autocratic governments, because what we see in fact in Russia is that ideology, or rather a lack thereof, lack of a consistent ideology, or lack of something, the perception that something needs to be presented so that everybody doesn't go rotten and Western, right, is an important driver behind a lot of things that Russia does. And I think Gudrun's example from the joint statement, and I think China's also white paper on democracy, on all these kinds of things, demonstrate that yes, they try to turn some of these words around, but at the same time there is this perception that there is an ideological divide. We're just different people, for example, when it comes to some of Russia's statements, right? We're different people, and if we somehow give in, then the idea of the West is to use us. So I think let's not, ideology is still has some merit when we analyze this binary. Thank you.
Thank you. You have touched upon my second question, and we can go deeper into that now. It is about the possible advantages and disadvantages of this kind of framing, of the binary framing. you started talking about it, and I definitely wish to go somewhat deeper into that. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this binary? Gudrun has already mentioned some, but maybe you want to go further.
Yeah, I think basically the advantages I see are the mobilizing effect domestically, and also justifying a certain pushback. You know, that, for example, China, to come back to the EU-China, which is also in the topic of today's meeting, if we talk about EU-China, to sort of mobilize people and make them aware that China is not an actor like any other actor. So Huawei is not any other foreign private company. It's a different animal. So if you use this kind of framing, it has a mobilizing effect, and it allows a certain pushback, which will not be formulated as a lex seneca only, but to create more awareness that, for example, what is critical infrastructure? Where do we not want to see Chinese investment, for example? So I see the advantages more on the domestic level. At the international level, I see very few advantages. And it's exactly what Zhang Yongjin already alluded to. If you use this framework, and you have something like the Summit for Democracy, like Joe Biden organized last year, who decides who is in and who is out? You know, of course, Washington in this case decided who is in and who is out. And if you ask me, if I look at the list, it's pretty dubious, some of it. So sometimes, and this is a side remark, I think that what is really meant when we talk about the ultimate battle between democracy and autocracy is powerful countries with autocratic leaders, but we're not talking about smaller countries about whose, you know, political system we frankly don't care. And it's even counterproductive to think in terms of autocracy, democracy. And I come back to what Zhang Yongjin said. I mean, if we talk about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, in the General Assembly, there were 141 nations who voted in favor of the resolution condemning Russia's invasion, right? I mean, this is unheard of. And it took a lot of lobbying work, I'm absolutely sure. But there are countries like Singapore, and Singapore has unilateral sanctions against Russia. If I take this framing seriously of autocracy and democracy, then I lose countries. I exclude countries like Singapore, because they're not seen as strictly in the Western camp. But as I said, I mean, we have a fluidity, we have a spectrum. So it excludes countries that might have the same interests, because they're also small countries or smaller countries than their big neighbors, and they don't want might to make right. So they identify with what we call the rules-based international order. But if we push them into a different camp, we might lose them as allies. And I mean, Una already talked about India and South Africa. I think it's a good example that countries have different reasons why they are, you know, share your position or don't share your position. And India has tried to avoid the binary choice here and has tried to do that for a very long time. And at the moment, I think that China and Russia try to exploit this fact. I come back to the statement again, the joint statement between Russia and China. In the very last paragraph, it mentions BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and even the trilateral format that still exists between China, India, and Russia. And Wani was a few days ago in India. So we have this ongoing effort to say to India, look, you're basically in our camp. You abstained in the UN Assembly, General Assembly vote. So, you know, you're not here and not there. And I'm really wondering what this will do to the Quad, for example. What the implications are for India's standing in the Quad, and you know the US-India relationship, etc., etc. So I think the disadvantage of having this kind of binary framework is that you exclude countries, and you naively assume that countries that you count to your camp will automatically share your position on certain things, which is, as we see, not true. And then my final point, there are problems in the world and issues that you cannot tackle when you know, they don't fall into the category autocracy, democracy. And I would say climate change, biodiversity are topics like that, but also there are issues like non-proliferation, where if you only win over the countries who share your opinion anyway, you have not accomplished anything. The NPT, something like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, can only work if the opponent is also in, and you have to create incentives for that and show that this is in everybody's interest.
Thank you very much. Which one of you wants to add things first? Zhang Yongjin, maybe?
Yes. Now, the very interesting Gudrun's.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted. You're muted. We still cannot hear you. No, we still cannot hear you somehow. Nope.
Maybe while
yeah, I think maybe Una comes first, then Yongjin, please try to fix your mic. Yeah.
Yongjin, I will buy you some time. Okay. No, I don't think Yongjin hears us, in fact.
I don't know. I mean, logging in. No.
Oh. Okay. So.
Una, go on.
Okay.
I will send Yongjin a chat. Okay.
Sweet. Okay. So yeah. I just want to say that sometimes when we're interested, maybe to kind of spin off on Gudrun's point, I think we get, when we are stuck in this binary, we kind of muddle it together with the idea of institutions, basically. Sometimes we make this simplified idea that just to go back to your example about Singapore, right? That somehow democracies all have excellent institutions. They have institutions that are open, that are transparent, and that are fair automatically. Although we know that in reality, that's not always the case. And somehow, interestingly, the same simplified idea also demonstrated in Russia's invasion, Russia's rhetoric vis-a-vis Ukraine. They're saying it's a failed state because they have bad institutions. So they're not a democracy. They're parading as one, but they're not, right? Because of bad institutions. But what the Ukrainians say, well, we do have bad institutions. We have a lot of corruption. We have issues, but we're striving to be, you know, we are trying to work towards and be a democracy. So, but at the end of the day, so from a perspective of this, you know, very basic institutionalism, it's not about autocracy or democracy. It's about the system that presents the most resilience domestically, and to go back to Gudrun's point that it matters domestically, against certain interests. But this is where I want to challenge Gudrun on the issue of, for example, climate change or any other interest where you have big lobby groups, or where you have interest, and when you have the institutions that are less transparent, as they sometimes are, and as they very often are with autocracies, it's hard to do the quote unquote right thing, because of these interests that are in control because of deep state, because of clashing, because of oligarchy, and so on and so forth. So maybe it's not a direct link, and it would be wrong to draw a direct line, but through the lens of institutionalism, I think we have to approach this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Yongjin's mic works now.
Are you sure? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, great.
Fantastic.
Great.
Yeah.
I was saying that Gudrun's point about camps remind me of the Cold War. I mean, really, that is very strong kind of resonance over there. My point is really the binary is there. I think the problem is not the binary itself. It's actually the kind of unspoken, unwarranted assumptions behind this kind of framing of binary. We seem, at least from what I can see, we seem to have what I call clash of civilizations redux. That is, we have a superior kind of political system vis-a-vis a barbaric political system. This is the struggle that we have to win, and then the world will be better with a better political system. There is also undertone of moral superiority over there to say liberal democracy is absolutely morally superior. So I think that is problematic. The binary thing is not necessarily problematic. For example, I mean, if you have a two political system, as also Gudrun at the very beginning mentioned, the EU says systemic rivalry. If we do have an open competition between the two political systems, let's say autocracy and democracy, to see as open contest, to see which system delivers, measured by human flourishing, various indexes, let's say. That will be actually a very healthy and good competition, probably benefit the world. So the binary itself, my point is not necessarily a problem. It's how, I mean, those assumptions behind the framing of the binary, that is a problem.
Thank you very much. I had one final question. Maybe you could respond to it very, very briefly, because after that I want to move beyond this more round and open it up to our two discussants. My final point was, could we move beyond this binary, and would we wish to move beyond the binary? And if yes, how? Yongjin, go on.
Okay. I'll just go for it very quickly.
Go for it.
I think, I mean, when you say we, I don't know who you're talking about. We, I mean, I think I wish you would move beyond the boundary. I mean, again, going back to Cold War, we all, I mean, let's say, take the Vietnam War as an example. We all thought, the Americans at least, or the West thought we were fighting communism. Eventually is nationalism. Sort of, are we fighting China or authoritarianism? I mean, that's my point. Stalin famously said, I hope this is correct, the Chinese communists are more Chinese than communists. Then the Chinese authoritarianism is more Chinese than authoritarian. So what are we doing then if we are fighting Chinese rather than fighting authoritarianism?
Very good point. So you basically say it's a clash of cultures. Yeah, it's East against West, basically. Yeah. Or,
well, I mean, yeah. If you look at autocracy as a tradition, that has thousands of years of tradition. I mean, can you beat autocracy? I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, if you are thinking of the kind of zero-sum game, democracy would definitely beat autocracy. I can't see. I mean, this will be forever war or forever whatever contest.
Thank you.
Okay, let me try to approach it from a different angle. I just think that for the reasons I lined out before, that the binary is not, it doesn't take into account the complexity of the issues we're dealing with. And for me, the right approach is what the EU tried in the Indo-Pacific strategy. in the Indo-Pacific strategy, it says we will cooperate with countries based on values or interests. What we should avoid is throwing around with words like-minded countries, rules-based international order, without looking exactly what do we mean by like-minded? Like-minded on what? You can be like-minded on one thing and totally not like-minded on another. And what we need is more flexible framework for cooperation, where we sometimes cooperate based on values we share. For example, I am in strong favor of strengthening the relationship between EU and Taiwan, because this is the model democracy, if you will, in Asia, without challenging the one China policy. But we should strengthen our relationship with Taiwan. So sometimes we can cooperate based on values and sometimes on interests, whether the EU, you know, which is institutionally not a very flexible entity, will be able to do that is a different question. But I think this is what is needed to get out of the binary. This does not mean that we can ignore the fact that there are grave, I mean, usually there are some autocracies where human rights violations are very grave, etc. And I think that for that, we need a toolbox. The EU has started to build one with the anti-coercion instrument, etc., with the sanctions mechanism. So we need to push back on that, but we should be open to cooperation on issues where like-mindedness does not mean you're in the same political camp.
Thank you very much. Una, your turn.
Yeah, it's hard to follow Gudrun. I'll just leave it here.
You're sure?
Yeah, I agree with her completely.
Lovely. Yeah.
I'm embarrassed now.
No, don't be. It's just fantastic. Thanks a lot. And
Yeah,
at this point, I want to give the floor to our two discussants. Let's listen to Nana first, Nana de Graaff, who is joining us from Amsterdam. She's a political scientist and she's working on the topic of economic elites, basically all over the world. So EU, United States, and China as well. So I wish you could respond to what has been said this far from this specific perspective and add your points.
Thank you very much, Agota, and thank you for organizing this. It's just excellent and a totally impossible task that we've been given, because many good things have been already brought to the fore, and these were also very good questions to start with, and there's so much to say about this. But okay, let me give it a try. I think one of the things that stands out from the questions and the responses so far is that this binary is obviously. It was, I think, also a rhetorical question to start with. It's obviously not a useful instrument. And it's obviously being used for political projects and for actually, I would say, repressive projects within democracies and autocracies alike. Because I think this binary and the kind of enemy thinking and framework that's also employed as what goes behind these binaries is also being used for political projects in what we see as, liberal or Western or whatever democracies. And so the question that then comes to the fore is, why is this binary so all-pervasive? Whereas as soon as we start discussing it or thinking about it, we see it's not useful. So is that because of these political projects? And is then, I'm also really also in this war that we are that's now being waged in Ukraine, and the way the media responds to this, I find it so difficult to see that the way reporting is being done is quite unnuanced and all the time falls into this framework of othering and in binaries and so on, which I think really blurs the really important questions that what is the underlying complex causes behind that Russia now waged this war. It's obviously an imperialist project from Russia's side, but what about American imperialism, as several of the speakers have addressed, that are also behind this conflict. And so this is the question that really stands out to me. So why is this binary being used so much, although it's obviously obscuring more than it clarifies, as far as I see it. And also what it really blurs is the very important question, namely what is behind this drive toward more repressive, authoritarian political leaders, countries becoming then more authoritarian, and so on. Because there are many causes behind this. And again, I think this has political causes, economic causes, and also US imperialism here has been an important driving force behind this. And what it also does is that it actually allows countries with a more repressive leadership, I should say, to justify that repression. And I see that happening in China, I see that happening in Russia, and I see it happening in the West. Because we justify use of violence and so on behind this frame, as far as I see it. So I'm very much in favor of what many of the speakers have been saying, and Gudrun has also very eloquently put this to differentiate, to nuance, to see where can we work together and cooperate on the basis of other kinds of categories, and not so much whether it's an autocracy or a democracy or on the basis of, for instance, ideology. So you asked this question, so when will we start moving beyond this binary when we think about China? And I fear that this is happening very soon. I fear that forces are being built up to also start framing China as this, the big enemy, the communist evil that, just like Russia will now start invading Taiwan and so on, totally glossing over all the complexities that are behind it, all the differences and all the nuances. So I really hope that the EU doesn't follow the US wake here. And I think that was also something that Zhang Yongjin brought to the fore, and I couldn't agree more. And finally, I've been hearing this, and something that I also want to stress here is that we should be very, and this is maybe the most difficult part, not maybe for this audience, but especially in the public debate, and I think that policymakers are increasingly also falling into this trap, is to step beyond this Western-centric sense of superiority, because even when we think about values I mean, you talked about these like-minded nations, Gudrun, but even a value like democracy or a value like liberty or freedom or whatever, we have a sense of, and we the West, that we know what goes into that concept and what is the best way to organize freedom, or what is the best way to organize democracy. But we know there's a big part of the world that doesn't necessarily see it this way, even how we think about democracy. And that applies not only to countries in the global South, but also in the United States. The United States is a divided country, a polarized country, and one side of the spectrum looks very different on what freedom and democracy means from the other side, and then there's many shades of gray in between. So I think I just joined the chorus that these three speakers have represented here today, and I'm really grateful to hear these voices. I hope we will hear that more in the public debate, because I feel there's a lack of these perspectives in the public debate. And I'm all for, I think Una was the one who suggested this, that move away from the binary, see it as a spectrum, and focus on all the differentiation in between what we call a democracy and an autocracy, and all the different kinds of layers that are inside these extremes as well. And now I'll give the floor to Marcin.
Marcin, yes, Marcin, it's finally your turn.
Yes.
Marcin Kaczmarski is joining us from Glasgow, political scientist as well, and his research focus is Russia-China relations. So Yeah, we cannot wait to hear your perspective on those issues. Yeah.
Thank you, Agota. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I would start with agreeing that nuances is necessary, and I have always been very much in favor of nuancing the analysis of Russian foreign policy till 24th of February, when it turned out that those who didn't nuance were right about what Russia was aiming to do, and those who took a more straightforward approach to Russian foreign policy. My point, I will try to look at commenting on what has been already said. I will try to look at the binaries from the perspective of Russia-China relations. And my main argument is that we are certainly not there in terms of Russia and China forming an authoritarian axis or forming an authoritarian bloc. But the war in Ukraine and the way in which China responds to this war may determine to what extent such a bloc may emerge. So, firstly, I would argue that Russian actions in Ukraine put Beijing in a very uncomfortable position, because on the one hand, it is what Gudrun was saying about the for February the statement signed by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin just before the war, and the elevation of their partnership to once again a new level, and the fact that China, while presenting a neutral position, is supporting in practice is supporting Russia. But at the same time, I think that the biggest question remains to what extent is China ready to support Russia in areas other than political, because in a sense, the political support is relatively cheap. Naturally, the European Union and the US have already started speaking about China's complicity in Russian invasion. They speak very much they try to they try to push China towards condemning Russia. But overall, I would still see it as acceptable. This policy of China is still acceptable towards for the EU and the US. But the biggest question is whether China is willing to support Russia financially, economically, whether it is ready to help Russia bypass sanctions, whether it is willing to invest in Russia under sanctions. And in this case, I think that China, there are two main scenarios. One in which China does support Russia, and this in turn generates much more cooperation between the US and the European Union. So I would argue that the extent of China's support for Russia may determine whether we see the emergence of this type of binary international politics between, on the one hand, the Russian-Chinese bloc, that I would like to emphasize once again, that I don't see being there at the moment, and on the other, the Western bloc, which would be united exactly by the Chinese support for Russia. As I understand Beijing's perspective, what China has been trying to do and what Russia failed to do in its policy was to keep the West divided. China, in my understanding, China has always been playing this game of the bad US and the good European Union, with the European Union being more open to cooperation with China. But from this perspective, any major support for Russia would undermine this policy, this long-term, what I would see as long-term policy of China to capitalize on differences between the EU and the US, which are there. At the same time, I think a lot depends on how the Chinese leadership interprets its relationship with the US, because if it sees the Sino-American rivalry as a long-term phenomenon that is going to stay there, China will have more incentives to support Russia. China will have more incentives to keep Russia as a state that preoccupies the West, that preoccupies the US, and which helps China to implement its policies in East Asia. So to sum up, I would say that this question whether there is a binary, it's still an open question, because a binary can emerge regardless of unwillingness of any side, of all sides, including Russia, including China, including the US and the EU, not to end up with such a binary. And I would stop here.
Thank you very much, Marcin. Any responses from the panelists? Nana?
I'll just have a very quick question to Marcin, because in my opening statement, I already said that China doesn't see this kind of strategic rivalry with the United States as a fight between democracy and autocracy. Why do you think, this kind of, if China, one side doesn't see this binary, only one side sees the binary, what's the dynamic over there?
Thank you, Yongjin, for this question. I think that when I speak about the binary, I would rather have a political binary in mind, a binary focused on strategic interests. I don't think that this line between democracy and autocracy is the most important here, although I agree with one of the comments when someone from our audience noticed the fear of regime survival on the part of non-democratic states. But my point is that a lot depends to what extent China sees the perspective of a kind of pause or a break in the rivalry with the US, regardless of the ideological components, but whether it makes sense for the Chinese leadership to seek a certain compromise or a strategic pause in this rivalry, or whether they interpret the situation as, in terms of quote unquote, the US will push China regardless of what China does. Because in such a case, China has more incentives to team up with Russia. And probably this ideological binary would be, as some of our panelists have already mentioned, it would be a good justification to increase centralization back at home, to find a justification for a more aggressive policy. But I would see the ideological dimension, I would see still as a secondary one.
Thank you. Gudrun, yes.
I want to pick up a few points. I mean, I think the ideological dimension is only one dimension of the US-China strategic rivalry. This is not the Cold War. This is the Cold War plus US-Japan in the 1980s. So it's about supremacy in technology, world leadership, which the US wants to keep. So there, and of course, China is not the Soviet Union. There is much more interdependence, which now starts to unravel because both sides are pushing this unraveling. And my problem with the binary is also that it can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. And what you said last, Marcin, is exactly that. I mean, as I see it, China has abstained. So they have not voted with Russia, so to speak, but they are pushing the false narratives, including on the bioweapons laboratory in Ukraine, about, it's all NATO's fault. This is all pushed by China as well. So at the rhetorical level, I think they are fully on the side of Russia. That doesn't mean that they will act upon that in terms of breaking or undermining the sanctions or anything. There was this article by a Chinese academic who said, this is an important moment, even more important than September 11. So after September 11, China for once was on the right side of history. And it gave them sort of the breathing space because it improved the relationship And for the US, you know, Afghanistan and the war against terror was all that counted at the time. This situation, I think, from the perspective of the Chinese leaders is different. They don't see that this is an opportunity to improve the relationship with the United States. And if you look at the US-China meetings that have taken place after the war began, the one between Sullivan and Yang Jiechi, well, basically the US position was, this is the red line. If you are selling weapons to Ukraine, you will have crossed the red line, and very grave consequences will come after that. If you don't, you have the status quo ante. You basically have the same strategic rivalry, which will probably be, you know, the dominant topic for the next decades. So I think that China's leadership thinks this boat has sailed, that there is an opportunity to improve the relationship between the US and China. And they start to see everything through the lens of this rivalry. And this brings me back to the EU to finish. I mean, China always says they're very much in favor of EU strategic autonomy. And we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of, you know, being sort of, this is just an instrument to try to divide the US and the European Union. So because of the binary and the lens the US sees things through and China sees things through, we are under a lot of pressure. And this makes the navigation, if we try to avoid the choice, so very hard, because we also don't want to play into the hands of China by, you know, weakening the transatlantic unity that we now on Ukraine have surprisingly found. But then, and this is my final point, think 3 years from now, if Donald Trump or a guy like him wins the US election, and where would we stand today on Ukraine and on Russia if Trump were still president in the United States? I mean, the guy basically said, Putin is a very clever person, and he treated Ukraine like a piece of real estate. So we also have to be concerned about, you know, the future developments in the United States. And this alone should be an inspiration to us to try to navigate, as hard as it is. Sorry for speaking so long.
No, thank you very much, Gudrun. It was great. Anyone of you wanting to add something? Una, yes.
Yeah, I was just writing down my thoughts, so sorry if they don't follow us, but just picking up on what colleagues have said, because I feel like this is a conversation. I think, Agota, you made that point that you want this to be kind of bouncing things off each other thing. So first of all, yes, we have to, of course, acknowledge, and I also agree with what Yongjin said and what others said, that autocracies are different amongst themselves too. So there's no such, you know, and just yesterday I was sifting through Weixin to kind of get a grasp of what my bubble is how it's approaching the Russia war in Ukraine. And what I realized is that there's an explainer circulating now. I think many of you have seen it because we share the same contacts among our Chinese colleagues, which is an explainer of the Russian system, saying that it's nothing like the Chinese one, and saying that Putin has basically backed himself into a corner and he cannot, you know, there's a lot of truth to that, right? But not saying that, you know, Putin is an authoritarian leader and that's why this is ABC, but basically saying that it's very different from what we're dealing with in China. Russia has the system. So back to my argument on institutions. And that's something we sometimes fail to notice when we're locked in this Russia-China romance story that I also do not buy. Second, there's another trap that we sometimes fall into when we do the democracy-autocracy thing, is that we fear that the autocracies only target democracies with their toolkit. So we know that, for example, China has a certain toolkit and it says to the West, be afraid, be very afraid. And we're very afraid, as if the others who, but sometimes what we perceive that Russia, and I've made this point before, so sorry if I, repeat myself, you've heard me make this point before, but that we feel that Russia is somehow immune to this toolkit. It's not. Russia has the exact same fears over China's assertiveness that we do in the West, and yet we somehow think that it is catering to us. And the same worries that over China's pressure that democracies do. And now the final incoherent point on the US, I just want to push back a little bit here. Yes, of course, we all know there are issues with their democracy, and we know that they've had their fair share of bad practices when it comes to, sorry, my children are walking back and forth. But it is still the only power that Russia reckons with when push comes to shove. So, and the only base in the power that, of course, yes, Trump aside, all that aside, but here and now, not without the what ifs, it did take a strong stance, unlike some of our colleagues in the European Union. So we don't have to talk about depending on them, of course, in the long term, but let's not jump into self-sufficiency before we actually can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Una. Anyone wanting to add a final comment on that before we open the floor for the audience?
Can I quickly add one point? This is more or less concerning the current kind of Western responses to the Russian invasion. I think there is a danger of what we might call strategic hubris. If Russia was, well, it's been defeated, so to speak, or in some ways defeated in this kind of war, we have to think whether that will lead to, for example, more provocative American policy towards Taiwan. I mean, Gudrun talks about EU should develop more relationship with Taiwan, obviously without breaking the one China policy. But the United States seems to have already started some very provocative action, sending very high-level unofficial delegation to Taiwan, for example, at the beginning of the conflict. And that is not really a good thing for, sort of kind of peace and stability that we all wish for. And that will reinforce this kind of, they will use this kind of binary rhetoric again to defend democracy, defend Taiwan, to defend democracy, whereas the real strategic purpose might be very different. So I think these kind of strategic hubris, sort of from the United States, we have to be very kind of wary about.
Thank you very much, Yongjin. I think it's time we turn to the Q&A.